When the Greeks told stories of tragedy, no family cast a darker shadow than the House of Atreus. From the very beginning, their name was tangled with betrayal, bloodshed, and crimes so monstrous that even the gods recoiled. They were kings and queens of Mycenae, leaders of great armies, and figures of legend. But beneath the glory ran a curse that poisoned every generation. Fathers betrayed sons, brothers tore each other apart, mothers murdered husbands, and children rose against their parents. No bond was sacred, no oath unbroken. Every act of violence seemed to demand another, until the family became trapped in an endless cycle of vengeance and ruin. The Greeks would come to remember them not just as rulers, but as the most tragic family in myth, forever marked by hubris, cannibalistic feasts, and the haunting sense that no matter what they did, blood always called for more blood. This is the story of the House of Atreus, the most tragic family in Greek mythology. Every curse has an origin, and for the House of Atreus it begins with a man who had everything and threw it all away. His name was Tantalus, a mortal king of Lydia, though in some traditions he was said to be the son of Zeus himself. Because of this divine connection, the gods showed him unusual favor. He was invited to Olympus, allowed to sit at their tables, drink their nectar, and taste the ambrosia that only immortals were meant to enjoy. Few mortals in all of myth were given such an honor. But where another man might have felt humbled, Tantalus let arrogance consume him. It wasn't enough to sit among the gods. He wanted to test them, even mock them. And so he devised one of the most gruesome tests ever imagined. At a banquet in his own halls, Tantalus slaughtered his son Pelops, cut the boy into pieces, and prepared him as a meal. Then he invited the gods to dine, placing this unholy dish before them. His intent, the stories say, was to see whether the gods truly were as wise and all-knowing as mortals believed. Would they recognize the horror set before them? Or would they eat as though nothing were wrong? The gods recoiled in disgust. One by one they saw through the trick. Only Demeter, distracted by grief over the loss of her daughter Persephone, absent-mindedly ate a single bite, a portion of Pelops' shoulder. When she realized what she had done, even she turned away, horrified. The Olympians wasted no time restoring what had been desecrated. They gathered the remains of Pelops, reformed his body, and breathed life back into him. To replace the missing shoulder Demeter had consumed, they crafted one of ivory, giving Pelops a mark that he would carry for the rest of his life, a reminder of the crime committed against him. But Tantalus was not forgiven. For betraying the gods' trust and for violating the sacred bond between father and child, he was struck down into Tartarus, the pit beneath the underworld where only the greatest sinners were cast. His punishment was a cruel reflection of his crime. In Tartarus, Tantalus was made to stand in a pool of water beneath trees heavy with fruit. Yet whenever he bent to drink, the water receded. Whenever he reached for the fruit, the branches pulled away. For all eternity, he would thirst and starve, tormented by food and drink forever out of reach. His name, Tantalus, became the root of the word tantalize, to tempt and never allow fulfillment. But the gods' wrath did not stop with him. His crime had poisoned his bloodline. It was said that from this moment forward, a curse clung to his descendants, ensuring that betrayal, violence, and cannibalism would stalk them for generations. The House of Atreus was born not from glory, but from this first unspeakable crime, a father's arrogance that doomed his children and his children's children. You might think that it should actually be called the House of Tantalus, since the curse started with him. But as you'll see later, Atreus's actions were so horrifying that the house fell under his name. Though Pelops was restored to life by the gods, his story did not unfold without shadow. He grew into a striking young man, tall, handsome, and touched by a divine glow. Some say Poseidon himself favored him, whisking him away for a time to serve as his cupbearer, granting him gifts and a kind of charm that few mortals could rival. Pelops returned to the mortal world with this aura of destiny around him, as though greatness were waiting just out of reach. But destiny in this family always carried a price. When Pelops came of age, he sought to win the hand of Hippodamia, the daughter of King Oenomaus of Pisa. Yet Oenomaus was no ordinary father guarding his daughter's marriage. He was a tyrant obsessed with a prophecy. The oracle had warned him that his death would come at the hands of his son-in-law. Terrified of this fate, Oenomaus devised a cruel way to ward off all suitors. Any man who wished to marry Hippodamia had to challenge him in a chariot race. If the suitor won, he earned her hand. If he lost, he would be killed. The king's chariot was unlike any other, drawn by horses said to have been a gift from Ares, swift as the wind and untiring. Suitor after suitor accepted the challenge, and one by one they died, their heads mounted on spikes around the palace as a warning. By the time Pelops arrived, a dozen or more had perished, yet he refused to back down. Pelops knew he could not win by strength alone. He approached Myrtilus, Oenomaus's trusted charioteer, and struck a secret bargain. Myrtilus, who was said to be a son of Hermes, was skilled beyond measure in handling horses and wheels. In exchange for a promise that Pelops would reward him, sometimes said with wealth, sometimes even with Hippodamia herself, Myrtilus agreed to sabotage the king's chariot. The day of the race came. Oenomaus thundered ahead, confident in his divine horses, but at the critical moment, the sabotaged chariot failed. The bronze linchpins that held the wheels in place gave way, replaced by wax that melted in the heat of the sun. The wheels tore free, the chariot shattered, and Oenomaus was dragged to his death. Pelops claimed victory, and with it, Hippodamia's hand. But victory was never clean in the House of Atreus. After the race, Myrtilus came to Pelops to claim his reward. Depending on the version, he either demanded Hippodamia as his prize or tried to force himself upon her. Outraged, Pelops betrayed the man who had secured his triumph. He seized Myrtilus and hurled him into the sea. As he fell, Myrtilus cursed Pelops and his descendants. It was the second great curse on the family. If Tantalus had stained the bloodline with hubris and betrayal, Pelops added treachery and murder. And though he went on to become a powerful king, fathering children who would rule Mycenae and Sparta, the shadow of Myrtilus's dying words clung to him. His descendants would be born into rivalry, deception, and bloodshed, just as the curse decreed. In Greek thought, this was the very essence of miasma, a spiritual pollution that could not be washed away. And so, the tragic destiny of the House of Atreus marched on, carried now by Pelops's sons, Atreus and Thyestes, brothers whose hatred would bring the curse to its most horrifying heights. From Pelops and Hippodamia came two sons, Atreus and Thyestes. Born into privilege, raised in a kingdom born of betrayal, the brothers should have inherited strength and unity. Instead, they inherited curses. And as often happens in the tales of doomed families, envy and ambition turned brother against brother. When Pelops died, the question of succession tore the family apart. Both Atreus and Thyestes sought the throne of Mycenae, and the struggle was bitter from the start. But their rivalry was not only political, it became deeply personal. Thyestes seduced Aerope, the wife of Atreus, and with her help plotted to steal the throne. At first, it seemed to work. Aerope betrayed Atreus by giving Thyestes a golden lamb, a sacred token that symbolized kingship. Possessing it, Thyestes declared himself ruler. Yet the gods, it seemed, favored Atreus for the moment. Zeus himself sent Hermes to restore Atreus's claim. With divine backing, Atreus reclaimed his throne and drove Thyestes into exile. But Atreus was not content with victory. Betrayed by his brother and his own wife, he burned for revenge, and in his fury, he devised a punishment so grotesque it would stain their family name forever. Feigning reconciliation, Atreus invited Thyestes and his sons back to Mycenae. He welcomed them with smiles and open arms, promising peace at last. Thyestes, weary of wandering and perhaps desperate for stability, accepted the offer. A grand feast was prepared. Wine flowed, laughter rang through the halls, and Thyestes ate heartily of the rich meat placed before him. Only after the feast did Atreus reveal the truth. The meal Thyestes had devoured was no ordinary meat, it was his own children. Atreus had slaughtered his nephews, cooked their flesh, and served them to their unsuspecting father. When Atreus revealed the severed heads and hands, Thyestes was struck with horror. So deep it is said his scream echoed through the palace like thunder. It was an act of vengeance beyond reason, beyond forgiveness. A brother betrayed his brother in the most intimate, cruel way imaginable, not by killing him, but by forcing him to consume his own bloodline. Even the gods were horrified, and yet, this atrocity only deepened the curse. For Thyestes fled into the night, broken but not destroyed, and in his heart he carried a new hunger, revenge that would one day match his brother's cruelty. The Banquet of Horror became one of the most infamous episodes in Greek myth, retold in tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Seneca as the ultimate symbol of familial corruption. It was no longer just a family under a curse. It was a family that embodied the curse, turning love into betrayal, kinship into cannibalism. The stage was set for the next generation, for prophecy and incest, for sons born to avenge fathers, and for the spiral of violence to sink even deeper. The curse of Tantalus and the curse of Menelaus had found their perfect heirs. Thyestes fled, Mycenae shattered, his sons butchered and their flesh forced upon him. But grief in Greek myth rarely ends in silence. For men like Thyestes, grief hardened into vengeance, and vengeance always found a way back into the story. He sought counsel from an oracle, desperate for guidance on how to answer his brother's monstrous cruelty. The prophecy he received was as disturbing as it was clear. The only way Thyestes could destroy Atreus was through a child born of incest with his own daughter. Only such a son, conceived in sin and secrecy, could avenge the banquet of horror. It was a prophecy soaked in despair, yet Thyestes obeyed it. He turned to his daughter Pelops, a young woman who had no choice in the matter. In some versions, he disguised himself or tricked her. In others, he forced her outright. From this violation, a child was conceived, Aegisthus. When the boy was born, Pelops abandoned him, overwhelmed by shame. In some tellings, she exposed the child to die. In others, she gave him away. Either way, Aegisthus did not remain lost for long. He was discovered and raised by shepherds, until one day he was brought to King Atreus himself. Unaware of the boy's true parentage, Atreus took him in and raised him as his own son. Here lies the cruel irony. Atreus, thinking he was extending mercy, was nurturing the very weapon of his destruction. For Aegisthus grew strong under Atreus's care, his destiny hidden until the truth emerged. When he came of age, Thyestes revealed to Aegisthus who he truly was, not the son of Atreus, but his nephew, born for the sole purpose of killing him. The prophecy demanded blood, and Aegisthus answered. He turned on Atreus and murdered him, fulfilling the oracle's dark decree. With Atreus dead, Thyestes reclaimed the throne of Mycenae, his vengeance finally satisfied. Yet even this triumph was hollow. For in killing Atreus, the cycle did not end, it only shifted. The curse was not lifted, the family not redeemed. Instead, it passed down once more, carried now by Atreus's sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus, who would rise against their uncle to seize back the kingdom and continue the blood feud. The birth of Aegisthus was not merely another chapter of betrayal, it was proof that fate itself conspired against the House of Atreus. Every attempt to escape their doom only dragged them further into it. Each generation was forced to reenact the same story of treachery and blood, as though the curse was not just upon their family, but written into their very marrow. And so, the throne of Mycenae became a seat of blood, passed not by rightful succession, but by murder, revenge, and prophecy. The curse had found its perfect heir, and in Aegisthus, Thyestes finally had his avenger. But for the House of Atreus, the horror was far from over. The next heirs of this doomed dynasty would take the curse into an even wider stage, the Trojan War itself. Hey everyone, before we continue, I've got some exciting news. My weekly video is now live on my new channel. Index Unknown. That's where I dive into the hidden side of history, the secrets, the theories, the conspiracies, the things they don't want you to know. This new video dives into the mystery of the Bermuda Triangle, a stretch of ocean where ships and planes have vanished without a trace. Is it just storms and human error, or is there something far stranger at play? The link's below if you're interested. Check it out after this video. With Atreus dead, the curse passed to his sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus. Though they had grown up in the shadow of betrayal and blood, the brothers were ambitious, cunning, and unshaken by the horrors that had swallowed their father. Together, they rose to power, driving their uncle Thyestes once again into exile. Agamemnon claimed the throne of Mycenae, making it one of the most powerful kingdoms in Greece. Menelaus secured Sparta through marriage to Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. For a time, it seemed the family had broken free from the curse, ruling with strength and prestige. But peace never lasted long in the House of Atreus. The spark came from Helen. Whether she went willingly or was stolen away, she left Sparta in the company of Paris, a prince of Troy. The act was seen as a grave insult, not just to Menelaus, but to all of Greece. To retrieve Helen, the kings and heroes of the Greek world united in arms. And who was chosen to lead them? None other than Agamemnon, lord of Mycenae. But even before the army set sail, the curse reared its head. As the fleets gathered at Aulis, the winds failed. The ships lay stranded, their sails limp, the sea unmoving. Days turned to weeks, and despair spread through the ranks. The seer Calchas revealed the reason. Agamemnon had offended Artemis, goddess of the hunt. Perhaps he had boasted that his skill surpassed hers, or perhaps he had slain a sacred stag. Whatever the crime, the goddess demanded a price before the winds would rise. Her demand was unthinkable. Agamemnon must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. The king faced an impossible choice. Without the winds, the war could not be fought, and the Greek coalition would dissolve in failure. Yet to appease Artemis, he would have to betray his own blood, repeating the pattern set by his cursed ancestors. At last, ambition outweighed love. Agamemnon lured Iphigenia to Aulis under the pretense of marriage to the hero Achilles. But when she arrived, she was seized, led to the altar, and offered as a sacrifice. Some versions say Artemis relented at the last moment, whisking the girl away and replacing her with a deer. Others insist she was slaughtered, her blood spilling on the stones while her mother Clytemnestra wept with rage. Either way, the damage was done. The winds rose, the ships sailed, and Agamemnon secured his place as commander of the Greek armies. But he had betrayed his daughter, destroyed his wife's trust, and stained his hands with blood that would one day demand repayment. For 10 long years, he led the war against Troy, clashing with Hector, quarreling with Achilles, and overseeing a conflict that left tens of thousands dead. He returned home not in glory, but carrying the seeds of his own destruction. At his side came Cassandra, the Trojan princess cursed by Apollo to speak the truth and never be believed. While Agamemnon dreamed of ruling in triumph, Clytemnestra dreamed only of vengeance. And waiting with her was Aegisthus, the child born of incest and prophecy, still nursing his father's hatred for the descendants of Atreus. The king of Mycenae was coming home, but for a man of cursed blood, homecomings rarely end in peace. When the Trojan War finally ended, Agamemnon returned home a victor. He had led the greatest army Greece had ever assembled, brought down the walls of Troy, and claimed spoils and captives that testified to his power. But the glory of war was a hollow shield against the curse that clung to him. For back in Mycenae, another story had been unfolding, a story that had nothing to do with battles and everything to do with blood. Waiting for him was Clytemnestra, his queen. To many Greeks, she was the perfect image of betrayal, a wife who murdered her husband. But her side of the story was far darker. She had watched as Agamemnon lured their daughter, Iphigenia, to what she believed was a wedding, only to cut her down as a sacrifice. The wound never healed. Each day of his absence, her grief hardened into hatred, and hatred into resolve. And then came Aegisthus. Born of incest and prophecy, raised on the bitterness of his father Thyestes, Aegisthus had every reason to despise the sons of Atreus. When Agamemnon sailed to Troy, Aegisthus saw his chance. He returned to Mycenae and seduced Clytemnestra, binding them together in lust, vengeance, and ambition. For 10 years they ruled in Agamemnon's absence, plotting the day his blood would spill. When the king finally returned, he did not come alone. Among his captives was Cassandra, the daughter of Priam and his new concubine. Cursed by Apollo to speak prophecies no one would believe, she foresaw the doom awaiting her in Mycenae. She knew that stepping into Agamemnon's halls meant stepping into her own grave, yet her warnings fell on deaf ears, as they always did. Agamemnon entered the palace in triumph, expecting feasts and loyalty. Clytemnestra welcomed him with smiles, weaving a net of false affection. In some versions, she persuaded him to walk across a purple tapestry, an act of arrogance reserved only for the gods, a symbolic hubris that sealed his fate. Once inside, she struck. The murder is told in many ways. Some say she waited until he bathed, then ensnared him in a cloth and struck him down with an axe. Others say she stabbed him with a blade while Aegisthus stood ready to finish the job. However it happened, the king who had brought down Troy was slaughtered not on the battlefield, but in his own home, naked and defenseless. Cassandra, too, met her end. Dragged inside the palace, she went to her death with full knowledge of what awaited her. No one believed her visions, yet they unfolded exactly as she had foretold. Her blood joined Agamemnon's on the palace floor, another victim claimed by the curse of the House of Atreus. When the deed was done, Clytemnestra stood over the body of her husband and declared that justice had been served. She had avenged her daughter, taken vengeance for years of betrayal, and freed herself from the shadow of a husband who had brought only blood into their house. To her, the murder was not treachery, it was justice. But justice in this family was never clean. It was vengeance, feeding vengeance, and vengeance demanding more blood. For waiting in the shadows were Agamemnon's surviving children, Electra and Orestes, who would one day rise to avenge their father, continuing the curse that had already consumed generations. The palace of Mycenae was drenched in blood once again. And with Agamemnon's death, the curse of Atreus reached a new crescendo. A husband slain by his wife, a king toppled not by enemies abroad, but by betrayal at home. Yet the tragedy was far from over, for the voices of vengeance had only begun to whisper in the ears of the next generation. The murder of Agamemnon did not end the curse, it merely shifted it to the next in line. His surviving children, Electra and Orestes, were left behind to live in a palace ruled by their father's killers. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus sat on the throne, their hands still red with blood, while the rightful heirs endured humiliation and grief. Electra, in particular, became the living embodiment of sorrow. She was forced to serve her mother, the very woman who had betrayed and slaughtered her father. Day after day, she lived under the shadow of injustice, her spirit worn thin but not broken. Ancient playwrights described her wandering the palace, unkempt, dressed in mourning rags, clinging to memories of her father and nursing a hatred so deep it became her only companion. She was consumed by one desire: vengeance. But Electra could not act alone. She pinned her hopes on her brother, Orestes, who had been spirited away as a child to live in exile. In him, she saw salvation, not just for herself, but for their father's honor and the shattered legacy of the Atreids. For years, she prayed for his return, whispered to the gods, and clung to the dream that one day justice would come. That day arrived when Orestes, now grown into a man, returned to Mycenae in secret. He came not as a prince, but as a shadow, guided by Apollo's oracle. The god had commanded him to avenge Agamemnon's death, declaring that if he failed, he would be cursed forever. It was not just duty or personal rage, it was divine will that drove him. The reunion of brother and sister is one of the most poignant moments in Greek tragedy. Electra, broken by years of despair, finally saw hope embodied in the figure of her brother. Orestes, hardened by exile, saw in Electra a reflection of everything he had lost. Together, they plotted the death of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. The plan was ruthless. Orestes entered the palace disguised as a traveler, bringing false news of his own death. Believing herself safe at last, Clytemnestra welcomed him, unaware that vengeance had already slipped through her doors. At the right moment, Orestes cast aside his disguise and struck. Aegisthus was killed swiftly, but Clytemnestra's death was far more complicated. For a moment, Orestes faltered. Clytemnestra, his own mother, bared her breast and begged him to remember the child she had once nursed. The bond of blood pulled at him, but Electra urged him onward, reminding him of their father, of Iphigenia, of the endless crimes that stained their family. With anguish tearing at his soul, Orestes drove his blade into his mother, spilling yet more blood in a house already drowned in it. The curse had claimed another victim, and justice had been served, but at a terrible price. The children of Agamemnon had avenged their father, but in doing so, Orestes had committed the ultimate taboo, matricide. He had killed his own mother, staining himself with a crime the Greeks considered nearly unforgivable. For Electra, there was relief, a dark satisfaction that her father had been avenged. For Orestes, there was only horror. No sooner had the blood dried than the air itself seemed to crackle with fury. He had freed the house from one stain, only to mark it with another. And in the silence that followed Clytemnestra's death, Orestes heard them for the first time, the footsteps of the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, already hunting him. The children of Agamemnon had carried the curse forward, proving once again that in the House of Atreus, blood always called for blood. When Orestes struck down his mother, silence fell over Mycenae. For one brief moment, it seemed as though justice had been served, the father avenged, the usurpers slain, the throne reclaimed. But in the world of the Greeks, blood did not wash away with more blood. Instead, it bred corruption, a stain that clung to the soul. Almost immediately, Orestes felt the weight of his crime pressing down on him. They came for him, the Furies, called the Erinyes, ancient goddesses older than even Zeus, born from the blood of Uranus himself. The Furies were relentless hunters of kinslayers. They rose from the earth, monstrous figures with snakes coiled in their hair, eyes burning with vengeance, and torches blazing in their hands. Orestes alone could see them at first, while those around him thought he had gone mad. But to Orestes, they were real, terrifying, merciless, and always close. Wherever he fled, they pursued. He could not eat without gagging on their cries, could not sleep without seeing their claws. Driven to the edge of madness, Orestes fled Mycenae and sought sanctuary. He turned to Apollo, who had once commanded him to avenge Agamemnon. Surely the god would protect him now. Apollo comforted him, declaring that his act had been justice, not crime. But even Apollo could not silence the Furies. They were older than him, older even than Olympus, and their purpose was absolute. Blood demanded blood. Finally, Orestes made his way to Athens, where he clasped the statue of Athena in desperation. The goddess of wisdom, unlike the others, saw beyond the endless cycle of vengeance. She decreed that Orestes should stand trial, not before gods alone, but before men as well. For the first time in myth, a murder born of vengeance would not be answered with another murder, but judged by law. The trial took place on the hill of the Areopagus, with a jury of Athenians seated to decide his fate. Apollo stood as Orestes' defender, while the Furies themselves acted as accusers. The courtroom trembled with their fury as they argued that no crime was greater than matricide, that Orestes had polluted the very ground with his mother's blood. Apollo countered that Orestes had acted in obedience to divine command, and that the bonds of marriage, broken when Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon, were greater than those of motherhood. The jury's votes were cast, and the count came back equal, half for acquittal, half for condemnation. In that moment, Athena herself cast the deciding vote. She sided with Orestes, declaring him absolved. The Furies raged, their ancient authority challenged, their cycle of vengeance broken. But Athena soothed them, promising that they would not be discarded, but honored as protectors of justice in Athens. Thus, they were given a new role as the Eumenides, the kindly ones, guardians of law instead of blind vengeance. For Orestes, the curse was lifted at last. He returned to Mycenae free from the madness that had tormented him. Yet the victory felt strange, his family reduced to ghosts, his legacy forever haunted by the crimes that had birthed it. And for the Greeks, this story marked something larger than one man's redemption. It was the turning point where endless blood feuds gave way to law, where the cycle of vengeance was broken not by another blade, but by judgment, reason, and mercy. The House of Atreus had suffered for generations, and though their name would forever be tied to tragedy, their story also carried a strange kind of hope, that even the deepest curse could one day be transformed. Greek mythology is filled with doomed families. The line of Oedipus is crushed by prophecy, with father killing son and children born of incest. The House of Minos suffers from betrayals, monsters, and ruin. But none carry the same weight of horror, the same inescapable darkness, as the House of Atreus. What sets them apart is not just one crime, but the way each generation adds another layer to the curse. Tantalus betrays the gods with cannibalism. Pelops betrays Myrtilus with treachery. Atreus betrays Thyestes with the banquet of horror. Thyestes betrays his own daughter with incest to create Aegisthus. Agamemnon betrays Clytemnestra by sacrificing Iphigenia. Clytemnestra betrays Agamemnon by murdering him. Orestes betrays his own blood by killing his mother. And through it all, Cassandra, Electra, and Iphigenia suffer as pawns in a curse they never chose. This was not just tragedy, it was tragedy as inheritance. Each betrayal did not end with the guilty party, but spilled over into the lives of their children, their siblings, their lovers. It was as if the curse itself were alive, weaving its way through every bond of kinship. Husband and wife, parent and child, brother and brother, every tie was corrupted, every oath broken. Even when divine justice intervened, as it did with the trial of Orestes, the solution did not erase the blood already spilled. It only stopped the spiral from continuing. The cost had already been paid in generations of torment, betrayal, and madness. The family remained forever a symbol of pollution, miasma, that no ritual, no sacrifice, no prayer could truly cleanse. And that, perhaps, is why the Greeks returned to their story again and again. In plays like Aeschylus's Oresteia, the House of Atreus became a mirror for human rage and divine order. It asked a question the Greeks themselves wrestled with. Can vengeance ever end, or does blood always demand more blood? The House of Atreus answered with centuries of suffering. It showed that unchecked pride, betrayal, and cruelty do not die with one person, but echo through generations. And yet, in Orestes' trial, it also offered the faintest glimmer of hope, that justice, law, and reason could one day replace the endless cycle of violence. But for the family itself, the damage was done. Their name became synonymous with horror, their legacy a chain of crimes that no victory could erase. Among all the cursed houses of Greek myth, none fell so far, none bled so deeply, none left such a haunting echo as the House of Atreus, the most tragic family ever to walk the stage of myth.